Hello, it is me. It's Miss Checka. I don't know why the video looks so yellow. I look like I'm in an old-timey movie. I don't know. Let's see here. Googling real fast. Okay. Anyway, I guess you're going to have to live with me looking like I'm in an old-timey movie for a little bit. And we're going to continue Holes, which is by Louis Sacker. And yesterday we met our protagonist, our main character, and his name is Stanley Yelnats. And we learned about Stanley that his name is a palindrome, that you can say it forwards and backwards, that his dad and his grandfather and I think his great-grandfather were also named Stanley Yelnats, that their house always smells bad because his dad is trying to invent something to recycle old shoes. But we also learned that he has been sent to Camp Green Lake, which is not a lake at all, but is in fact a juvenile detention center. And it has these like really poisonous lizards. So that's what we learned yesterday. So let's pick up on chapter 5. There were 6 large gray tents, and each one had a black letter on it: A, B, C, D, E, or F. The first 5 tents were for the campers. The counselors slept in F. Stanley was assigned to D tent. Mr. Pendanski was his counselor. "My name is easy to remember," said Mr. Pendanski, as he shook hands with Stanley just outside the tent. 3 easy words: pen, dance, key. So like pen and dance and key. Mr. Pendanski was younger than Mr. Sir and not nearly as scary looking. The top of his head was shaved so close it almost looked bald, but his face was covered in a thick curly black beard. His nose was badly sunburned. "Mr. Sir isn't really so bad," said Mr. Pendanski. "He's just been in a bad mood ever since he quit smoking. The person you got to worry about is the warden. There's really only one rule at Camp Green Lake: don't upset the warden." Stanley nodded as if he understood. "I want you to know, Stanley, that I respect you," Mr. Pendanski said. "I understand you've made some bad mistakes in your life. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But everyone makes mistakes. You may have done some bad things, but that doesn't mean that you're a bad kid." Stanley nodded. It seemed pointless to try and tell his counselor he was innocent. He figured that everybody probably said that. He didn't want Mr. Pendanski to think he had a bad attitude. "I'm going to help you turn your life around," said his counselor, "but you're going to have to help too. Can I count on your help?" "Yes, sir," Stanley said. Mr. Pendanski said, "Good," and patted Stanley on the back. 2 boys carrying a shovel were coming across the compound. Mr. Pendanski called to them. "Rex, Alan, I want you to come and say hello to Stanley. He's the newest member of our team." I see Christian is here. Tess is here, and Tess is getting the book. Woohoo! Yeah, this is a favorite of mine too. The boys glanced wearily at Stanley. They were dripping with sweat, and their faces were so dirty that it took Stanley a moment to notice that one kid was white and the other kid was black. "What happened to Barf Bag?" asked the black kid. "Louis is still in the hospital," said Mr. Pendanski. "He won't be returning." He told the boys to come shake Stanley's hands and introduce themselves like gentlemen. "Hi," the white kid grunted. "That's Alan," said Mr. Pendanski. "My name's not Alan," the boy said. "It's Squid, and that's X-Ray." "Hey," said X-Ray. He smiled and shook Stanley's hand. He wore glasses, but they were so dirty that Stanley wondered how he could see out of them. And honestly, my glasses are dirty too, so... Mr. Pendanski told Alan to go to the rec hall and bring the other boys to meet Stanley. Then he led them inside the tent. There were 7 cots, each one less than 2 feet from the one next to it. "Which was Louis's cot?" Mr. Pendanski asked. "Barf Bag slept here," said X-Ray, kicking at one of the beds. "All right, Stanley, that'll be yours." said Mr. Pinansky. Stanley looked at the cot and nodded. He was not particularly thrilled about sleeping in the same cot that had been used by somebody named Barfbag. 7 crates were stacked in 2 piles at one side of the tent. The opened end of the crates faced outward. Stanley put his backpack, change of clothes, and a towel in what used to be Barfbag's crate. It was at the bottom of the stack that had 3 in it. Squid returned with 4 other boys. The first 3 were introduced by Mr. Pinansky as Jose, Theodore, and Ricky. They called themselves Magnet, Armpit, and Zigzag. They all have nicknames, explained Mr. Pinansky. However, I prefer to use the names their parents gave them, the names that society will recognize them by when they return to become useful and hardworking members of society. It ain't just a nickname, X-Ray told Mr. Pinansky. He tapped the rim of his glasses. I can see inside you, Mom. You got a big fat heart. The last boy either didn't have a real name or else he didn't have a nickname. Both Mr. Pinansky and X-Ray called him Zero. You know why his name's Zero? Asked Mr. Pinansky. 'Cause there's nothing inside his head. He smiled and playfully shook Zero's shoulder. Zero said nothing. And that's Mom, a boy said. Mr. Pinansky smiled at him. If it makes you feel better to call me Mom, Theodore, go ahead and call me Mom. He turned to Stanley. If you have any questions, Theodore will help you. You got that, Theodore? I'm depending on you. Theodore spit a thin line of saliva between his teeth, causing some of the other boys to complain about the need to keep their home sanitary. Ew! I hope y'all don't spit. You were all new here once, said Mr. Pinansky, and you all know what it feels like. I'm counting on every one of you to help Stanley. Stanley looked at the ground. Mr. Pinansky left the tent, and soon the other boys began to file out as well, taking their towels and change of clothes with them. Stanley was relieved to be alone. But he was so thirsty, he felt that he would die if he didn't get something to drink soon. Hey, Theodore, he said, going after him. Do you know where I can fill my canteen? Christian Alexander, don't be spitting 6 feet. Ew. Theodore whirled and grabbed Stanley by the collar. My name's not Theodore, he said. It's Armpit. He threw Stanley to the ground. Stanley stared up at him, terrified. There's a water spigot on the wall of the shower stall. Thanks, Armpit, said Stanley. As he watched the boy turn and walk away, he couldn't for the life of him figure out why anyone would want to be called Armpit. In a way, it made him feel a little better about having to sleep in a cot that had been used by somebody named Barfbag. Maybe it was a sign of respect. Chapter 6. Stanley took a shower, if you can call it that, after ate dinner, if you could call it that, and went to bed, if you could call his smelly and scratchy cot a bed. Because of the scarcity of water, each camper was only allowed a 4-minute shower. It took Stanley nearly that long to get used to the cold water. There was no knob for hot water. He kept stepping into it, jumping back from the spray until the water shut off automatically. He never managed to use his bar of soap, which was just as well because he didn't have the time to rinse off the suds. Ooh. Dinner was some kind of stewed meat and vegetables. The meat was brown and the vegetables had once been green. Everything tasted pretty much the same. He ate it all and used his slice of white bread to mop up the juice. Stanley had never been one to leave food on the plate, no matter how it tasted. What'd you do? One of the campers asked him. At first, Stanley didn't know what he meant. Well, they sent you here for a reason. Oh, he realized, I stole a pair of sneakers. The other boys thought that was funny. Stanley sure didn't know why. But maybe because their crimes were a lot worse than stealing shoes from a store? Or were they on someone's feet? Asked Squid. Neither, Stanley answered. They belonged to Clyde Livingston. Nobody believed him. Sweet feet, said X-Ray. Yeah, right. No way, said Squid. Now, as Stanley lay on his cot, he thought it was kind of funny in a way. Nobody had believed him when he said he was innocent. And now, when he said that he stole them, nobody believed him either. Clyde Sweetbeat Livingston was a famous baseball player. He led the American League in stolen bases over the last 3 years. He was also the only player in history to ever hit 4 triples in one game. Stanley had a poster of him hanging on the wall of his bedroom. I mean, he used to have the poster anyway. He didn't know where it was now. It had been taken by the police and was used as evidence of his guilt in the courtroom. Clyde Livingston also came to court. In spite of everything, when Stanley found out that Sweetbeat was going to be there, he was actually excited about the prospect of meeting his hero. Clyde Livingston testified that they were his sneakers and that he had donated them to help raise money for the homeless shelter. He said he couldn't imagine what kind of horrible person would steal from homeless children. That was the worst part for Stanley. His hero thought he was a no good, dirty, rotten thief. As Stanley tried to turn over on his cot, he was afraid it was going to collapse under all his weight. He barely fit in it. When he finally managed to roll over on his stomach, the smell was so bad that he had to turn over again and try sleeping on his back. The cot smelled like sour milk. Though it was night, the air was still very warm. Armpit was snoring 2 cots away. Back at school, a bully named Derek Dunn used to torment Stanley. The teachers never took Stanley's complaints seriously because Derek was so much smaller than Stanley. Some teachers even seemed to find it amusing that a little kid like Derek could pick on someone as big as Stanley. On the day Stanley was arrested, Derek had taken Stanley's notebook and after a long game of come and get it, finally dropped it in the toilet in the boys' restroom. By the time Stanley retrieved it, he'd missed his bus and had to walk home. It was while he was walking home carrying his wet notebook with the prospect of having to copy the ruined pages that the sneakers fell from the sky. I was walking home and the sneakers fell from the sky, he had told the judge. One hit me on the head. And it hurt too. They hadn't exactly fallen from the sky. He just walked out from under a freeway overpass when the shoe hit him on the head. Stanley took it as some kind of sign. His father had been trying to figure out a way to recycle old sneakers, and suddenly a pair of sneakers fell on top of him, seemingly out of nowhere, like a gift from God. Naturally, he'd had no way of knowing they belonged to Clyde Livingston. In fact, the shoes were anything but sweet. Whoever had worn them had had a bad case of foot odor. Stanley couldn't help but think that there was something special about the shoes. They would somehow provide the key to his father's invention. It was too much of a coincidence to be a mere accident. Stanley had felt like he was holding destiny's shoes. He ran. Thinking back now, he wasn't sure why he ran. Maybe he was in a hurry to bring the shoes to his father. Maybe he was trying to run away from his miserable and humiliating day at school. A patrol car pulled alongside him. A policeman asked him why he was running. Then he took the shoes and made a call on the radio. Shortly thereafter, Stanley was arrested. It turned out the sneakers had been stolen from a display at the homeless shelter. That evening, rich people were going to come to the shelter and pay $100 to eat the food that the poor people ate every day for free. Clyde Livingston, who had once lived at the shelter when he was younger, was going to speak and sign autographs. His shoes would be auctioned, and it was expected that they would sell for over $5,000. All the money would go to help the homeless. Because of the baseball schedule, Stanley's trial was delayed several months. His parents couldn't afford a lawyer. You don't need a lawyer, his mother had said. Just tell the truth. Stanley had told the truth, but perhaps it would have been better if he had lied a little. He could have said that he found the shoes in the street. No one believed that they fell from the sky. It wasn't destiny, he realized. It was his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. The judge called Stanley's crime Despicable. The shoes were valued at over $5,000. It was money that could provide food and shelter for the homeless, and you stole that from them just so you could have a souvenir. The judge said there was an opening at Camp Green Lake, and he suggested that the discipline of the camp might improve Stanley's character. It was either that or jail. Stanley's parents asked if they could have some time to find out more about Camp Green Lake, but the judge advised them to make a quick decision. Vacancies don't last long at Camp Green Lake. So we just learned a whole lot about Stanley, right? Everybody thinks that he did this terrible, terrible thing that he basically stole from homeless families, but he didn't. And then now that he's at Camp Green Lake, the other campers don't think that he stole something. So can't win. Poor Stanley. I keep looking at my batteries because I have 3% left. I'm going to read fast. Chapter 7. The shovel felt heavy in Stanley's soft, fleshy hands. He tried to jam it into the earth, but the blade banged against the ground and bounced off without making a dent. The vibrations ran up the shaft of the shovel and into Stanley's wrists, making his bones rattle. It was still dark. The only light came from the moon and the stars, more stars than Stanley had ever seen. It seemed he had only just gotten to sleep when Mr. Pendanski came in and woke everyone up. Using all his might, he brought the shovel back down onto the dry lake bed. The force stung his hands but made no impression on the earth. He wondered if he had a defective shovel. He glanced at Zero about 15 feet away, who scooped out a shovel full of dirt and dumped it in a pile that was already a foot tall. For breakfast, they'd been served some kind of lukewarm cereal. The best part was the orange juice. They each got a pint carton. The cereal actually didn't taste too bad, but it had smelled just like his cot. Then they filled their canteens, got their shovels, and were marched out across the lake. Each group was assigned a different area. The shovels were kept in a shed near the showers. They all looked the same to Stanley, although X-Ray had his own special shovel, which no one else was allowed to use. X-Ray claimed it was shorter than the others, but if it was only by a fraction of an inch. The shovels were 5 feet long, from the tip of the steel blade to the end of the wooden shaft. Stanley's hole would have to be as deep as his shovel, and he'd have to be able to lay the shovel flat across the bottom in any direction. That was why Zero had wanted the shortest shovel. And just for comparison, guys, I'm 5'3", so it'd have to be like that much shorter than me. And almost as far, evidently, as Christian Alexander can spit. Shaking my head. The lake was so full of holes and mounds that it reminded Stanley of pictures he'd seen of the moon. If you find anything interesting or unusual, said Mr. Pendanski had told him, you should report it either to me or Mr. Sir when we come around with the water truck. If the warden likes what you found, you'll get the rest of the day off. Well, what are you supposed to be looking for? Stanley asked him. Well, you're not looking for anything. You're digging to build character. It's just if you find anything, the warden would like to know about that. He glanced helplessly at his shovel. It wasn't defective. He was defective. He noticed a thin crack in the ground. He placed the point of his shovel on top of it, then jumped on the back of the blade with both feet. The shovel sank a few inches into the packed earth. He smiled. For once in his life, it paid to be overweight. He leaned on the shaft and pried up his first shovel full of dirt, then dumped it off to the side. Only 10 million more to go, he thought, then placed the shovel back in the crack and jumped on it again. He unearthed several shovelfuls of dirt in this manner before it occurred to him that he was dumping his dirt within the perimeter of the hole. He laid his shovel flat on the ground and marked where the edges of his hole would be. 5 feet was awfully wide. He moved the dirt he'd already dug out past his mark. He took a drink from his canteen. 5 feet would be awfully deep, too. The digging got easier after a while. The ground was hardest at the surface, where the sun had baked a crust about 8 inches deep. Beneath that, the earth was looser. But by the time Stanley broke past the crust, a blister had formed in the middle of his right thumb, and it hurt to hold the shovel. So we're going to stop right there. So we're like a page and a half into chapter 7. Tess, 5 inches taller than you. You probably need to like practice shoveling. Yeah, that doesn't sound very fun though, guys, does it, to be digging holes? All right, that's it for today, but I will see you guys tomorrow, same bat time, same bat place. So, bye.